Morning, everyone. Welcome to PuppetConf. I see some yellow lanyards out there. Welcome. We're going to talk about enjoying the journey from Puppet 3 to 4. Again, my name is Rob Nelson. I work for AT&T. Just a little bit about myself. I've been working with Puppet since 2014, since about 3 days. I've done a number of upgrades to Puppet 4 myself. I'm a contributor to Vox Populi and Puppet Lint. If you're not familiar with either of those projects, I'll be glad to talk about them afterward. But the point is, I've been doing this for a while, and I've tried to take some of the lessons I've learned with all the support to do this talk. I'm rnelson0 on Twitter, same thing on SlideShare, which is where the slides will be posted afterward. Some of the slides I'm going to kind of skim over, and they've got some links in them. Feel free to go out and check out more details later. And my blog, rnelson0.com. So we've got a lot to talk about today. We're going to start with why to upgrade. You're here at PuppetConf, but some of your coworkers, your boss, you may need to provide them some reasons, so we'll let them know why. We're going to have to refactor our code base to Puppet 4. Then we're going to go do the upgrades of the master and agents to 4. And then we're going to go back and we're going to refactor some more code. We're going to try and take advantage of the new stuff and get rid of some of the old stuff that's gone away. And where I hope to we're going to have to rush through some of the content, but I really think tips, tricks, and tools. As I said, I've done some upgrades. I've tried to collect other tips and tricks from people in the community on issues they've had and resolved, which I think are kind of the real difficult parts. So, and of course, we're going to try and enjoy ourselves. Upgrading often is very tedious work and doesn't get the recognition it should. So we're going to try and find ways to enjoy it and make sure that we're successful with it too. So first off, why? As I said, you're here, but when you go back and talk to your coworkers, Puppet 4 isn't new anymore. It's about 18 months old now. That makes Puppet 3 really old. And who here knows that it has end of support at the end of the year? Okay, well that's good. Most people do. So you got about 2.5 months to kind of get off it. We know it's not really going to turn into a pumpkin on January 1st, but we don't really want to put ourselves in that situation because we're going to start to see things like Puppet 4 only modules that aren't going to have backwards compatibility to version 3. Not a good place to be in. There's also a lot of language improvements. I was thinking of things like application orchestration, which they really highlighted in the keynote today. The thing like was it Puppet Docker build? That's pretty awesome. So you're going to want to be able to take advantage of these things, and if you're on 3, you're not really going to be able to. The all-in-one agent for Puppet and then the Puppet server environment instead of Passenger are pretty exciting too, especially your security auditors probably really like the all-in-one. You get pretty recent Ruby and OpenSSL and other tools. You can certainly use, like Red Hat has their own Puppet that's not an all-in-one if you really want to, but I definitely encourage this. Some of the reasons is Puppet 4, you generally get better performance, the security implications, and you get the same agent and Puppet server between open source and enterprise. So it doesn't matter which one you use, you don't have to worry about the differences between the two as much. And of course, Puppet 5 is coming. We don't know when, but if we do the upgrades now, we put ourselves in a better situation. You know, we don't have to go 2 major versions at once. Now this talk's going to pretty much apply to everybody. Really doesn't matter if you're using enterprise, open source, master or not. For Red Hat Satellite People Foreman 113 has Puppet 4 support. Let's lay out the blueprint at a real high level. We're obviously going to start with Puppet 3. If you are on Puppet 2, is anybody here on Puppet 2? Okay, this talk is not specifically about that. Hopefully some of the lessons will apply, but there was a number of talks at PuppetConf last year. There's a number of blog posts out there. Anybody here just starting with Puppet? Okay, so if you're not using it, start with 4. First thing we're going to do is read the release notes. We're going to figure out what's changed from the version we're on to the target. Then we're going to use that and build out a roadmap of all the versions that we need to hit between where we are and where we need to go. We're going to validate and create some tests. Hopefully you have some tests. If not, we'll talk about getting started there. And we're going to refactor our code for the support for the next version until we pass all the tests. Then we're going to do the upgrades. We'll start with the master. If that works, we're going to do the agents. And then we're going to go through our roadmap and repeat those steps for every version we need to hit. Until we get to 4.7.0 is the latest now, I believe. So the release notes, nobody really likes reading them, but you have to. You have to read all the release notes. For most of us, you're probably going to feel like you wasted your time, but they describe bugs, deprecated features, issues that people run into. A lot of them are edge cases. If you're the edge case, it's really important for you to find out before you do the upgrades. It'll also help you determine minimum versions that can hit your target version. This is where you might have to hit some intermediate versions along the way. Hopefully not, but it may happen. And of course, the point here is stay up to date. If you got to read one release note to determine whether or not you can upgrade, that's easy. If you got to read 17 of them, it's a little more difficult, a little more tedious. Based on what we find, we build out that roadmap. Determine your current version. Hopefully, your whole fleet of whatever you're running is the same version. If there are different versions between the master and the agents, or some masters have different versions, get that figured out first. Get them on the same version before you start. Then we need to figure out whether we're going to do an in-place upgrade or some new infrastructure. There's a lot of ways to tackle that. We'll spend a lot of time on that. And then identify those intermediate versions. And we're going to look at feature flags. Feature parser is off by default in Puppet 3, and you can turn it on. When you get to Puppet 4, it's on and you can't turn it off. So we need to make sure we address that. And strict variables, I encourage this, but that's strictly optional. It defaults to false in 4 as well. If you have PE, you probably are going to have to hit some intermediate versions. The other way to get around that is to do a fresh install. You might lose some classifier information. Some of us use the classifier, some don't, so it may not matter as much. There's KB articles. You can engage support. We'll have to figure that one out. With FOSS, you can pretty much just go straight to 4.7.0, the latest one right now. You don't have to hit intermediate versions of 4. Now, outside of Puppet, we're talking about the Puppet upgrade, but make sure you realize how it's going to affect your infrastructure, your monitoring, logging, anything else that Puppet generates, especially dynamic. A lot of people probably have dynamic monitoring. You don't want to find out that you did the upgrade and everything looks good in your monitoring because half of the dynamic information just got lost. So figure out how that's going to affect you, and that's really going to get into your implementation. So we're going to talk about it today, but you're going to have to do the legwork on that one. And at the very least, make sure the people watching a dashboard or ticket queues know when you're doing the upgrade so they aren't surprised by a bunch of red. Here's an example roadmap for FOSS. We'll pretend we're starting with 3.6.0 today. We're going to go to 3.8.7. That's the latest version 3. Then we're going to turn on the feature parser, maybe strict variables. Then we're going to go straight to 4.7.0. Pretty simple. And that's the roadmap we're going to use today. So as we go through, I'm just going to reference this. If you have Puppet Enterprise, it's a little different. Say you got PE 3.7.2, the latest is PE 3.8.6 in that train. And we again turn on the feature parser, strict variables. Now we don't go to the latest, which actually saw an email right before here, 2016.4.0 is out, so this is a little out of date, but we're gonna have to jump to a 2015 version first, and then we can jump to 2016.2.1. You can't go straight from 3.8.6 to 2016.2.1. I'm assuming the same thing for 4.0. Next up, validate and create test. Does everybody here have test working in their system? Only a few hands? Okay. So there are 2 testing talks today, or at PuppetConf. One is today at 2:30, it's turning pain into gain, and one in 3:45 tomorrow, the future of testing Puppet code. Definitely encourage you to go take a look at those because we don't have the time to dive into that real deep. The first thing you need to do, though, is determine what kind of tests you need. I recommend at least unit tests, which basically you write a line of code and you have a test to make sure that that does what you think it does. There's acceptance and integration, which might spin up a VM and make sure it actually deploys right, make sure that the package you defined, which is correct in the catalog, actually exists in the repos that you have access to. Since many of us don't have testing setups or we don't have mature ones, take a look at the Puppet module skeleton project. You can generate new modules with a good test system set up, or you can basically stand up a brand new one that you're not really going to use and crib the config into your existing modules. There's also a tool called Puppet Retrospec. You can use it with the module skeleton, and you tell it what kind of module you're creating. Maybe you're going to do some types and providers, and it'll build a framework including test for you. It's very naive in that it takes the code you've written and writes tests that it pass. So it assumes that your code works the way you intend it to. The important thing here is we're going to write these tests and we're going to make sure that our tests start passing, hopefully before we start modifying code. But if it's new to you, you need to make sure that the behavior is actually what you expect. Test only model what we tell them to. So you got to figure that part out. When we get to the point where we're going to turn on Future Parser, which is going to be our second in our roadmap, I highly suggest you only turn that on when you get to 3.8. You can turn that on before. I've talked to some people that turned it on as early as 3.2. There are bugs in it. There are changes to the Puppet 4 language that weren't available in the 3.2 version, so you could spend a lot of time troubleshooting things that are already fixed. So I highly encourage waiting until you get to 3.8 to turn that on. Of course, if you already have it turned on, then you have to deal with some of that, but hopefully not. PuppetLint, I mentioned I'm a contributor to that. We have some community plugins available for version 4 transition. These are things that haven't really changed per se what you want to enforce for style, but there are things where behavior changes. If you hold to the old style, you'll see some differences. I learned about this one at, actually, somebody told me this tip yesterday at the Community Summit, so I don't have great detail on that, but see me after if you want to get some detail, and I'll make sure I get it attached to the slides as well. Now you can go a little bit beyond some of the tests we're talking about here. Maybe you've got some systems at work that can do tests for you. You can also look at catalog diffs. There is a talk tomorrow at 1 p.m. called Getting to the Latest Puppet that spends a good bit of time on the catalog diffs. That basically takes your agent and generates a catalog using 2 versions of Puppet. So you can do 3.6.0 and 3.8.7 and compare the 2. That might be useful for some people. It really depends on your setup. But again, go see that talk tomorrow, Getting to the Latest Puppet, if you're interested in that. For those without test, here's a quick example of what it looks like. This is just an RSpec unit test. We say we want to profile Apache as our class name. We want to make sure that the class itself is created and that it's got a package and a user. When we run the test, everything comes back green. If any of our code doesn't match what our test does, those lines would show in red, so it's pretty easy to diagnose. And I recommend this at your very minimum, especially on your profile classes. We probably spend a lot of our time writing profile classes more so than component modules. So I recommend, even though a lot of testing guides talk about it with component modules, that's what we write our code with, so that's where we should spend our time testing. Now the next step is to do some refactoring. So the first thing is, everybody's using version control? Anybody not using version control? Okay. Create a new branch. We'll call it 3.8.7 since that's where we're going. We wanted to then set up in our new branch test against both the old and the new. So we would go 3.6.0 and 3.8.0. That little tilde greater than means that you get the latest in that train. So it'd be like 3.6, I don't know what the latest 3.6 was, but you get 3.8.7 would be the latest 3.8. And when we get to that, we can also turn on future parser and strict variables through the testing infrastructure as well. We figure out what tests are failing and we refactor. Sometimes we're going to be changing the test. Most of the time, we're probably going to be changing the code if you have something mature. If you're building it out, maybe the other way around. Then we have to upgrade modules. This is a good time to do it. We'll talk about some caveats later. Take a look at the required Puppet module version, or required Puppet version for the module. You don't want to upgrade to something that only has support for Puppet 4 before you get there. So you might want to hit some intermediate. Also take a look for anything that hasn't had an update in a while. Take a look at the README for it. It might have moved to another namespace. Vox Pupillae, we take over a lot of orphaned modules. We have something like 110 repos out there with all sorts of modules. So see if it's changed, maybe ownership. We're not the only group that takes in other modules, so there's a lot out there like that. And you want to move forward when your tests start getting green for your new version for 3.8.7. When you make some of those changes, you're doing your testing, the previous might start showing red, and that's okay because you've got a new branch, so your production branch for 3.6.0 should all still be green. You're making changes over here in 3.8.7, you're going to see what changes. It's okay if the old ones start going red. Don't move forward until you get it green. Once it's green, again, quick example of testing. We have a stanza here for the Puppet gem. We're going to either pull from a environment variable Puppet gem version or defaults to the latest 4.0. When we set that version, that environment variable to that tilde greater than 3.8.0, we end up getting 3.8.7. We can set it to specific versions if we want. A lot of things you can do with this, just an example to show you. When we use bundle, it gives us a self-contained environment where we can do testing with the different versions of the gem. It doesn't change the Puppet that's on the system. So that's how you do your testing on a live system. All right, the next step, once all our tests are passing, is we're going to look at the master upgrade. Now, this gets into a lot of detail. First thing we need to do is figure out how we're going to go forward. We're going to either do something brand new or we're going to do something in place. And even within those two, there's a number of ways to do it. You could do a new master on the same IP. You could do it on a different IP. You could import the old CA information. You could start a new CA. Tons of different ways. The usual one, it depends. There's no right answer for this. Take a look at your architecture and figure out what suits you. And there's a lot of work in this space to help with migration. So right before this talk, somebody told me there's some work going on to help with these transitions. Take a look at what shows up, say, in the Puppet blog. I'm sure things will show up there soon when that's released. Once you decide on your path, you're going to either deploy your new or your upgrade master, hopefully in some sort of testing environment. That way we can do a test, we can see how it works. When we're done, we can revert it, maybe repeat the process to ensure that the changes we made after things maybe didn't work right, that we can actually repeat them so we know going forward that it's going to work. And if you don't have that, then you're going to skip right to this step where you deploy into production. When you do that, definitely make sure you start with your parent nodes, which would be your master of master. If you got a few data centers and maybe there's one master ends up sending out messages to or code out to the others, make sure you start with those. And then if you have separate Puppet DB node, make sure you upgrade that too. Don't forget that. Same thing if you got a separate Puppet console for PE. When you do that, upgrade the Puppet DB termini on your masters, and also keep in mind that the Puppet DB will get reports during testing from no-op runs, from any canary nodes. You may not want that data to persist, especially if you have, say, dynamic load balancers or monitoring. It could pollute Puppet DB, and then the next time things check in, they get what's now stale or incorrect data. So make sure, especially when we do moving forward and rolling back with snapshots, make sure you keep Puppet DB with the master. So let's say you're going to replace the master. Again, there's still so many ways to do this. It's really hard to cover this, but we're going to try and set up some sort of new operational environment. It's a really overloaded term. We mean put it on a separate VLAN, a separate data center, separate availability zone, something so that we prevent existing agents from trying to get a catalog from the master unless they're canary nodes. We only want our canary nodes to get that. We don't want to propagate anything that might be bad. Then you deploy your new master. Obviously, make sure it's on the target Puppet version, in this case 3.8.7. Bootstrap your config. This would be going to be your control repo, your high-red data, R10K setup, anything like that, code manager for PE. Get all that stuff out there. If you don't have that, we'll talk about in-place upgrades on the next slide, but I definitely recommend you figure out what your Bootstrap process is and develop it. At some point, maybe you're running an EL7 now. At some point, maybe you switch to Ubuntu or EL8 comes out. You're going to actually need to do a fresh master instead of an in-place. So get to this point at some time. Once you've got that ready, you should be able to have the master test against itself. Just check in Puppet agent-T. And then once that happens, you can start testing with your canary nodes, whatever's in the same operational environment, maybe move some stuff over. If you can't do that, we can do an in-place upgrade. And in this case, we're talking the same node, not replacing that node on the same IP. I use VMware, so I use the term snapshot, but whatever you can do to make sure that you can get back to a known good state. Maybe you have to do backup and restores, whatever. Make sure you get the master and the canary nodes, because those are going to be affected too. And then since it's in place, we have to do something a little different to prevent agents from checking in to the wrong master. Quite a few ways to do it, just a few. Use the firewall load balancer to control which agents can check into which master. You could just use orchestration to turn off Puppet agent for a while. Now these last two are, may sound wrong, but you can revoke the certs for your non-canary nodes. That's okay if you have maybe a small fleet. If you have a larger fleet, you could revoke the CA and then generate a new one, and on your canary nodes, generate new certs. It sounds kind of crazy, but since you're doing a snapshot, you can do that for testing, and then you roll back, and everything works fine, and then you do your upgrade without restricting access, without revoking the CAs, and everything just goes. So there's so many different ways to do this, but again, just make sure that agents aren't checking into the wrong thing, getting the wrong catalogs. Then we do the upgrade of the master, and again, the same thing, Puppet agent-t, make sure the master can check in with itself, and then move on to the canary agents. Now, hopefully everything goes well, but often it doesn't. I think the first 3 or 4 upgrades I did really did not, they went spectacularly not well. So some things to take a look at with troubleshooting. Hopefully you get an error message that tells you something isn't working, and then it's usually pretty easy to debug. However, it's probably going to come down to agents not behaving the way you expect. Take a look at change resources. Anything that changed is suspect, especially since our tests all passed and we shouldn't be changing behavior. Look at also the number of resources in the catalog. If you went from 100 resources to 110 managed on a node, whatever. But if you go from 100 to 800, maybe you switched over to using some iteration and that went wrong. Just some suggestions. Hopefully you can revert that production environment. Puppet's pretty important where I am. I'm sure if it's down for a long time, it at least doesn't look good. So make sure we can get back. And that gives us time to sit back and actually analyze it instead of trying to troubleshoot it while it's on fire. Once we figure out what's going wrong, we're going to go back to the refactor step, code, data, test, whatever it is, try and get it fixed for the next attempt, and then give that a shot. Now, this seems pretty obvious here, learn from failures. What I mean by this is often we're going to run into a class of problems that we have, and it might come down to your tests aren't robust enough is a good example. Try and address that so that way the next time you do it, at least you're hitting a different class of errors. Once you get past this step, then we can look at upgrading the agents. You can almost always skip patch versions. You can skip a lot of minor versions, and again, you got to go back to the release notes. You can usually skip like the 3.6.0 on the agents. When you get to 3.8.7, you're going to want to upgrade them, and then after you get to 4, you'll then want to upgrade them as well. Quite a few ways to do this. I like the Puppet Agent module by Puppet Labs, or just Puppet now. This goes out and will upgrade the agents by migrating certificates, upgrading the packages, removing the old packages, adding repos, all that stuff. If that doesn't work for you for some reason, you can do it yourself, use some sort of orchestration. If you've got immutable infrastructure, maybe just deploy new nodes on a new template running the right version of Puppet. Or you can do it by hand. Not everybody's got a huge fleet. My home lab, I almost always do by hand, like 10 nodes, not a big deal. Whatever it is, also keep in mind, Puppet just changed their GPG signing key recently. They have instructions on their website of how to deal with that. If you have existing agents, that might cause you some grief, though, until you get the key updated. And then you got to repeat this. We saw 3.6.0 to 3.8.7, a couple more steps, but remember, we're trying to enjoy ourselves. Take a moment, relax. Upgrading stuff is hard. This first one especially is going to be a pretty difficult hump for some of us to get over. What we do, take the time to celebrate it, not just you, but hopefully with your team, with people that rely on Puppet. Make sure that everybody gets the recognition they deserve. After you take a moment, then we got to get back to it. We got to look at the next version. And again, we're just going to repeat those refactor and upgrade steps a few times till we get where we need to be. Once we get to 4.7, we're done, right? But not really. I love this quote. Software being done is like lawn being mowed. Nobody likes mowing the lawn, but we have to do it, right? So a few ways we can do that. First off, a lot of language improvements. I'm not going to have the time to dive into that. There's certainly a lot of talks here about that in the Puppet 4 track. But we want to start taking advantage of that. We want to take advantage of tools. With Puppet Enterprise, you can replace R10K with Code Manager. A lot of file locations changed, tons of stuff like that. PE's got quarterly upgrades, so you can pretty much put it on your calendar. As I said, today, 2016.4.0 was announced, and I'm sure 3 or 4 months from now, we'll see 2015.1. FOSS, it's more frequent. It's whenever they release a new one, so you might have to do a little more work there to keep up. Good old DevOps mantra, the less frequently you do something, the more painful it is. The more frequently we do these upgrades, the less work there is in between, the more familiar we are with it, the less chance we have to run into problems. Usually the better it is for us. And since we're almost upon the election to steal a quote. Upgrade early and upgrade often. It's key. Personally, I try not to get more than 2 minors behind. Sometimes there's good reasons to skip them. Who here got bit by 4.6.0? There were some bugs in it. I see at least one person. Not a big deal to get a few behind, but try not to get more than 2 or 3 behind if you can. Great way to keep up with this. I showed it in that gem file before. Use that tilde greater than 4.0. Your automated testing will automatically grab the latest one the moment it's released. If you're using Jenkins or Travis, just make sure you're building new environments instead of trying to recycle. And in your automated test, run bundle update, and you'll get the new gem. Sometimes that can cause you pain because you get upgraded to a new version and things start breaking and you're not ready to use it, but it's a good way to get that early alert, and then you can figure out if you want to try and fix your code ahead of time or modify your testing until you're ready to go. Now this slide's really heavy. I'm just going to kind of highlight a few things. Create resources is a great anti-pattern, very common. I'm sure most people have at least heard some complaints about that. Iteration is much better. Template type, EPP, extended Puppet template. You get to write your templates in Puppet DSL instead of Ruby. I don't know about all of you, but I'm not great with Ruby, so that's appealing to me. But the Ruby ERB doesn't go away. It also tries to fix some of the scoping issues. So you can still mix and match ERB and EPP as needed. I really love the changes to Hira that have shown up in 4, especially Puppet lookup and data in modules. I think those have really changed the way we're writing our code. So I highly encourage those. As I mentioned, there's a number of talks in the Puppet 4 track. Pay attention to it. Keep up with the blogs. Join the mailing list. Stay apprised of these changes before they hit you. And again, this will be on the slide share. Go take a look at all the links when you get a chance. So now I think this is probably what people want to hear is the tips and tricks. We'll start with Puppet Enterprise. And again, this is not just from my experience, but I've tried to collect it from the greater Puppet community as well. PE, nobody likes calling support, but if you've got PE, you've got a support contract, use it. They've got KB articles, you can open a ticket if you got questions about planning, and when you do the upgrade, if you have issues, open a ticket. If you need more than that, they also have an upgrade service where you can engage pro services to actually help you do the work. Might be appealing, especially if you've got a lot of things you're supporting and there's only 1 or 2 of you. PE classifier, the changes in it have bitten me more than once, specifically pre-configured node groups. They have documentation on how to recreate those when you do an upgrade if those get lost or damaged. You don't have to use a special PE Puppet server gem for a provider. You can just use the Puppet server gem. Same one between open source and PE, so your manifests don't have to have a whole bunch of conditionals in it. Okay, does anybody use either the PE or the all-in-one bundled Ruby for anything? Great, you're all doing it right. Don't do that, and if you have to, don't do it on your master. It can be quite tempting, especially if you're stuck on like Enterprise Linux 5 with Ruby 1.8.7. That's not a good place, but try not to do that. Strings. I don't think any language out there doesn't make strings really fun to deal with, and Puppet's no exception. So you need to understand how the different tools, Puppet itself, and some of the ecosystem work with strings. An example here is undef. In RSpec Puppet, if you put just single quotes around it, it's an undef value. In Puppet, it's a string. Use the symbol :undef, and that'll probably work for you. Where you might see this is when you've got a file that's made from combined variables. The one in front, instead of being nothing, actually becomes the word undef, and you get that file, which doesn't have a full path and it's not valid. Other places to show up is definitely with truthiness and falsiness. Usually you don't want the quotes around it, especially when you come from Hira. Tons of stuff coming from Hira. ENC can have this issue. Quoted numbers as strings for file modes. Often they have a 0 in the front, which turns them into an octal number, which is not what you want. Stringified structured facts, case selectors, all places you can run into it. Here's the real fun part about it. All your acceptance tests and unit tests may show up fine, and then you move it into production, and it doesn't work the way you want. Or vice versa. All your tests are failing, but stuff in production is working just fine. I ran into this with an array of NFS exports. If you stringify that and make it all commas, the exports don't really work anymore. And then you get a call about 30 minutes later saying, why can't I see the images on the site? So Some things to at least be aware of. I'm sure most people will run into something, but hopefully it's minor. Hiera's got some changes too. When you upgrade to the 4X Puppet server from 3, you're going to lose the environment you had before. It's a brand new environment, so eYAML isn't there. Does anybody use eYAML, encrypted YAML? Okay. So the way around this is make sure you have the YAML backend enabled as well. You're not just relying on eYAML, as some of us probably do. And of course, make sure the master doesn't use anything that's encrypted YAML. That's okay for me. I think it's probably okay for most. Then after you do your install and upgrade on the master, when it checks in with itself, use a module like Puppet Hiera to deploy your eYAML settings. It checks in, it deploys the gem on itself, it restarts the Puppet server so it's available for clients, and then when the first agent checks in, it can get encrypted YAML data. That is supposed to then persist through 4X. That's what it says in the documentation. I've heard from 1 or 2 people who have said they've seen it lost when they do upgrades. Don't have anything solid on that, but wanted to pass that on. There's also some fun with scoping, and I'm definitely not going to read this, just going to kind of point to it. You want to have your environment variable interpolated by Hiera, but you're generating it through a Puppet module, so you need to stop interpolation. You put the first empty braces in between, and it prevents it from being interpolated, and you have something Hiera can interpolate. The problem is, from 4.0 to 4.4, it spits out that weird scoping thing, that Hiera with a bunch of numbers after it. Just put 2 colons in between the curly braces, and it works the way you want. I saw that when we did the upgrade to 2015 before we went to 2016. I think that one runs 4.4, so you may run into that one. The great news is once you do that, you don't have to come back and change it later. Even though the above starts working after 4.5, the bottom one with the colons in it still works. So you only need to make that change once. Another thing I ran into with 2015 was that the data dir. If you know at the command line, if it's in your Hiera config with a colon in front of it, it doesn't normalize that. You've got to put the colons in front of it. I saw issues here with the environment in the data dir where it wasn't behaving the way I expected like that. It was mismatching it. I did a couple deploys where the master wasn't getting any data from Hiera, and it was installing all the defaults instead of everything I specified. So I just had to go in there and tweak that. Can't really pin that one down, just again, a pointer. I saw that with 2015, so if you start seeing your Hiera data get weird on the master after you do an upgrade, take a look at that. Some other general tips and tricks. Talked about reviewing the modules. Some might have Puppet 4 support, some might not. Trust but verify here. If they say they support greater than or equal to 3, doesn't always mean that they tested with 4. They might have had that Travis or Jenkins setup from 2013, and they may not have added the less than 4 part when 4 was released. So go take a look at the test setup for a module, make sure it's actually being tested against the code you're running. You can also maybe do some tests yourself on that code to make sure it performs the way you want. When you upgrade across the major version of the module itself, like say from Puppet Labs MySQL 3 to 5, you could probably run into some issues. I encourage you to do the upgrades early, but keep those things in mind. It may be reasons to prevent upgrading right away in the modules and hold that off until after you get to 4. There's tons of tools. We all want to do version pinning in our Puppet file, but there's tons of tools out there to help us bring it up to date instead of having to go out to the forge, read what the version is, check out all the dependencies. Nobody wants to do that. That'll just go through and upgrade everything. You could choose what you want to take or leave out of that. But lots of tools out there. Mentioned scoping issues with the ERB. The most common one is that you have your variable listed as a bare word, put an @ sign in front of it, and that's almost always the fix. Hopefully you've got some sort of pre-commit check-in that links your ERB. It won't show that. That'll show up during acceptance test or if you actually inspect the ERB output. Another tip I heard from somebody yesterday is look for hard-coded paths that have changed. A great example is etc Puppet. It should be etc Puppet Labs now. So grep through, this person just had a script that grepped through all their configs and made sure that if they found that, it showed up in a report, and then they could analyze it, see if it was a problem. You should probably be using something like CodeDir or ConfDir, which are dynamic and help you preserve it across versions as you upgrade. Does anybody use external facts? Okay. If you use external facts, you expect those to override calculated facts. This bug here, fact 1413, will only affect people with external facts, but what it does is the external fact actually gets overridden by the calculated one, which is the exact opposite of what you want. I haven't been bitten by this myself, but I know that there is a fix for it. It is pushed to factor, but it is not in the latest Puppet agent that's been pushed out. So if that applies to you, take a look at that bug. There are some workarounds, or you might have to upgrade to certain versions that aren't affected and hold off there until it's in a published version. Now we're going to be making a ton of changes, so this is impossible to not have coupled or entangled changes at all, but we're going to be upgrading Puppet, we're going to be upgrading a bunch of modules, we've done a ton of code changes. You kind of have to do that. Don't do something like upgrade the distro that your master is running on at the same time. Don't switch everything to containers at the same time. Try and be sane there. And finally, ask for help. Again, I see a lot of people wearing yellow lanyards. This is a great community. This is my second PuppetConf. I've been part of the community for a couple years. Nobody wants you to suffer in silence. Ask. Somebody will help you figure it out, whether you've got a support contract or not. Talk to people you work with, talk to people here, social media, great. There's a couple other tools for that. Puppet Community Slack, hopefully you're all part of that. There's a PuppetConf channel, not just great for help with Puppet upgrades, but if you want to grab food tonight, I'm sure somebody will say where they're at. IRC is great too, and there's a ton of mailing lists. There's an announced mailing list so you know when new versions are released. There's a users, development one, and a special PE, plus a bunch of others. Make sure you're on at least a few of those so you're apprised of the right things. And if you know what you're doing, hopefully you can help contribute back and help other people. Once you've gone through something, if you see somebody else, speak up and help them out. That's what makes this such a great community. We're going to be upgrading a lot of code. There's this tool called Puppet Ghostbuster that helps find unused code, classes and types that aren't used. Maybe you can get rid of some of that code or even wipe out modules that maybe were added a few years ago and you're not using anymore. There's no reason to upgrade it. You know, the best code is the code you don't have to write. All these tools, our Spec Puppet, Puppet Lint, the Spec Helper, are improving their Puppet 4 support. Some of them are getting a little behind, but we're working hard at getting it upgraded. If you've struggled with it in the past, please go out, take a look. If we don't have issues for it, please raise issues. If you can submit a PR, that's even better. We love that, but we are really trying hard as a community to get that support in place. Continues to improve, and we're really hoping we can address whatever problems you have. I mentioned the catalog diff tools. I think what's going to be talked about at that other talk today is the Puppet Labs one, but there are a few other diff generators, and I actually found a graphical viewer because I don't like looking at that kind of stuff at the command line, but plenty of options out there if that's appealing to you. A few more links. The official Puppet upgrade docs. Hopefully this talk has been really helpful to you, but it's a great reference for you, for your teammates, for people who haven't done this before, and they always keep updating those to make sure they're current. Ari and Martin are both doing some of those talks about Puppet 4 language, so they've got some talks recorded you can go look at, and you can hopefully find them here at the conference, either ask them questions directly or attend their talks. And similar to this talk, I found a blog post by Jonas Gennett about his company's journey from Puppet 3.8 to 4, which kind of went through the same kind of thing, edge cases he ran into, and that might be helpful as well. So it's a lot of content, so just to kind of wrap it up, we're going to build out a roadmap. We're going to start at 3.6.0, go to 3.8.7, whatever versions you need. We're going to make sure we got working tests. Sounds like some of us have some work to do building that up, but remember, you start and you improve it over time. We're going to step through the different versions and feature flags until we get to the top. And then we're going to go back and we're going to refactor our code again, start taking advantage of the new things and start removing some of the old things. We're going to keep mowing. Damn lawn. And we're going to do our best to enjoy the journey. You know, this is hard. For myself, as I said, I did a few, and the first one took me probably 3 months to get through. And it's a very small installation. After that, it got a little easier, and been trying to stay more up to date myself. So again, hopefully we can enjoy this, find ways to make it not so obnoxious. And we have some time for questions. I'd also encourage anybody who has been through an upgrade process before and maybe has something to share to speak up as well. It's going to be on SlideShare. Yeah, it's a LinkedIn property.
And about open source, you said about enterprise. About that open source edition, we are using R10K. So, is there any similar tools for Puppet 4?
You can still use R10K.
We can continue because last time we looked, but it was a few months ago, it didn't support the Puppet 4.
I'm using it with Puppet 4. There are some, it is a Ruby program, so it could depend on what kind of Ruby you have. Like if you're running Enterprise Linux 6, you kind of run into some issues there. But it should have support. If you're using Puppet Enterprise, you have Code Manager, but you can still use R10K.
Okay, thank you.
I didn't see you mention anything about Ruby code and plugins and custom types and stuff. I know moving to Ruby 1.9 probably has some things to consider.
Yeah, so from a Ruby perspective, I haven't written a lot of types and providers myself, just some like custom facts. If you're writing with things that aren't supported anymore in Ruby 2.3, I think is where the latest Puppet agent is, you may run into some issues. I don't have a good handle on, and I haven't seen anything that has a good handle on how to prevent that from showing up. But I think if you, like I'm using Travis, if I have my Travis set up to do test against like 3.8 and then 4.0 and then 4.7. So, and then also tie it into different RVM versions like 1.9.3 and 2.2. And I would assume that would be where it would crop up, but definitely something I can look into. Stick around after, I'll get your contact info, and I'll see if I can find something specifically.
Do you know the pricing for that Puppet Enterprise upgrade service?
I do not. I would assume somebody here from Puppet might be willing to talk to you about it, though.
I had a question if you've ran into this before. Have you upgraded from 3 to 4 and had agents that were in no-op mode? So we've actually been experiencing that at our work where since they're in no-op and we don't own the actual agents or that infrastructure, they'll drop the certs and then they'll never reconnect.
Okay, no, I have not run it in no-op mode myself. I believe I understand what you're talking about, but I've not seen that one addressed either. Again, we can talk afterward and
Sure.
then maybe get some details from you and see if I can maybe attach that to the slides or something.
Sure, that'd be great.
Yeah, going forward, I guess when's the best time to upgrade? Day of release sounds like it's going to send you face first into all of the sharp edges that haven't been sanded off yet. Wait long enough, and I didn't see any talks this session about upgrading from 0.24 all the way up to version 4. What's the sweet spot for that?
As I said, you want to. So I work for AT&T. We're a large enterprise, and we move slowly. So we stay like just a little bit behind, but I'm actually, since I got the announcement, I'm looking at going to 2016-4 probably maybe in November. So give it a little time to sit in because we're not, we're getting close to the like change freeze holiday times. But generally we read the release notes, figure out what kind of stuff was fixed to see if that's important to you. If it's not important to you, sit on it a little longer. Give it at least a week to see how other people do. But if it does fix something, I think that's when you make the jump to it and say, okay, we're gonna give this a shot and see if this addresses our needs. And it also may matter whether or not you have a single environment of production or whether or not you have some sort of lab.
Okay, and then this is our last question before lunch. So.
Actually, I just wanted to comment on the Ruby thing. So for Factor Facts, there was a bunch of libraries that we shipped, and when we moved from Factor not being written in Ruby anymore, if you relied on those to do some of your parsing, that's one issue. And then the only other thing I wanted to mention was if you're using Puppet Server, JRuby acts like a 1.9 server. So for catalog compilation, you won't see as many issues actually if you've already moved to Puppet Server. So.
Thank you.
All right, cool. So
All right, well, thank you, everybody.